Hello everyone and welcome to another video on the channel, and welcome to another GT Sport opinion piece where we're going to touch a little bit of a touchy subject. In this one we are going to ask, is Gran Turismo Sport a sim? Now do imagine every time I say sim that I'm doing some air quotes there. Now in my opinion, Gran Turismo Sport is a full-on racing sim, and hopefully during the course of this video I can outline the reasons why. Now the reason for making this video is because in the last few weeks I'm a member of quite a few other YouTubers' Discords, and also subscribe to a lot of their channels. I watch their videos, and Rory Alexander, here he is, put out a poll asking what is your favourite racing sim on either console or PC, and a lot of people chose Gran Turismo Sport, and this seemed to upset a number of people within the comments who claimed that Gran Turismo Sport isn't a sim, it's an arcade game. All kind of the sort of usual responses you might expect from some of the more elitist people out there in the community, but basically it was scoffing at the fact that Gran Turismo Sport could be considered a simulator. So what is a sim, and how we define the term sim when it comes to racing games? Now it's a fairly subjective point of view. People have different parameters and checklists necessary in order for a racing game to be considered a simulator. However, a quick look at Wikipedia describes sim racing as the collective term for computer software that attempts to accurately simulate auto racing, complete with real-world variables such as fuel usage, damage, tyre wear and grip, along with suspension settings. Now, going by that definition there, Gran Turismo Sport certainly covers the vast majority of them, if not all of them, in some way, shape or form. So in my opinion, going by the definition of sim racing from the internet or Wikipedia, Gran Turismo Sport certainly deserves to be considered within the sim racing family. However, for the purposes of this video, the definition of a sim is simply going to be the games that are considered to be the benchmarks within the category. So what I'm going to try and do is present a case to you here that GT Sport does pretty much everything that iRacing and ACC do, Assetto Corsa Competizione. Now if I can kind of put the case together that what you get in those games you also get in GT Sport, and they're considered to be the kind of benchmark when it comes to sim racing, then GT Sport certainly has to be considered a sim. So the first thing we're going to look at is the driving experience. Does Gran Turismo Sport play and feel like ACC or iRacing? Now what I've done here is intertwined a lap of Monza in the Group 3 Lexus with the BOP off, so it's in its kind of natural state. We've got fuel at ×1 and tyres at ×1. We're on the racing hard tyres, and we're just going to see, is the driving experience similar to something like ACC? So we're in cockpit view. Anybody who watches my streams know that I play on the bonnet cam and not everything in the cockpit view, because simply I'm a little bit faster in that regard. But that doesn't mean that we're not playing a sim if we don't use the cockpit cam, because in ACC you don't have to use the cockpit cam. You can obviously use bonnet cam or the chase cam just like you can in Gran Turismo Sport. But what I kind of very quickly realised here is that in terms of how you tackle the circuit and how the circuit feels within both of these games is remarkably similar. Braking points are very, very similar. The weight of the car on corner entry feels very, very similar as well. Now I don't play a whole lot of Assetto Corsa Competizione, I play a whole lot of Gran Turismo Sport, but what I felt, or what I feel, is that I can simply jump into Assetto Corsa Competizione and simply drive the car in exactly the same way as I do in GT Sport, with very, very similar results. I can attack most of the curbs and Monza in the same way, with maybe the exception of the second chicane. I can brake at exactly the same points, I can throw the car into the corners in a very similar manner, and at the end of the day they produce very, very similar lap times. The fuel between both of the games is remarkably similar. Now ACC does have a lot more road fuel compared to GT Sport, I will say that much, but GT Sport can be a little bit trickier coming out of some of the slower corners compared to the sim. But the point I'm trying to stress here is that if ACC is considered a full-on racing sim because of how you drive the car, and I can basically drive the car exactly the same way as I do in GT Sport, then GT Sport has to be considered certainly more sim than arcade. So we're going to move on to another example here, and it is Laguna Seca. We're in the BMW M4 from Group 4 for GT Sport, and we'll be in the BMW M4 GT4 for iRacing. Now, Group 4 cars, or sorry, GT4 cars do not run ABS, so you will notice down there on the ABS that I have turned ABS off for this comparison, just to closely match the car up as much as we can to the iRacing BMW M4 GT4. Now, turning ABS off in GT Sport fundamentally changes the way you have to approach the braking zones, particularly into turns at number 1 and the corkscrew. So when the ABS is off, if you're braking anything other than a straight line, the back end is very likely to get out of shape. We actually have a little bit of a moment here into turn number 5, a little bit of counter steer, fix that nicely. But coming into the big braking zones like the corkscrew that we're about to approach here, particularly as we go over the crest of the hill, the back end of the car is going to get light anyway. You then hit the brakes. If you try to trail brake into the apex, you're probably just going to spin the car, and you get a very, very similar effect as you do to iRacing. A lot of the other parts of the lap are also very similar in terms of gearing, in terms of where you sort of let the car just coast around the corner. This corner here a good example, and also the second last turn here as well. You very much come off the throttle and the brake and just let the car roll round the corner to get the best results. And so hopefully what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that you kind of have to take the same approach in both iRacing and GT Sport in order to get the M4 around the lap here. The traits are very similar on how you approach each corner, gearing, braking, all that kind of stuff. And if iRacing is considered, one of the benchmarks of the sim racing world, and I can sort of drive GT Sport in a very similar manner, it does make me wonder, beg the question as to why you can call it an arcade game. So that's point number 1. Let's move on to point number 2, and that is setups. Now in Gran Turismo Sport, within sport mode, all the cars have a fixed setup. You can't change anything in the suspension, the ride height, anything like that. But does that mean that GT Sport's not a sim because of it? Well, the evidence says no. A lot of the current series in iRacing also run fixed setups. In fact, a lot of the most popular series in iRacing, like the Ferrari GT3 fixed series, are all based on a fixed setup because the developers, much like Polyphony Digital, realise that people sometimes just don't want to mess about with that stuff. Assetto Corsa Competizione takes a slightly different approach, of course, although there's just a couple of preset setups with safe and the aggressive. Again, the developer realises that people just don't have the time or the will to invest into making setups for cars, and that's why in terms of iRacing and both ACC you can actually buy setups, and as far as I'm aware, I don't know anyone who does their own setups. The vast majority of people buy setups. Next on, we're going to move on to damage. A lot of people I've seen a few people say that, well, you don't have damage, you can't hurt the car, there's no risk in Gran Turismo Sport. And to be honest with you, it's kind of true within the sport mode part of the game, but there is still heavy damage within GT Sport as a game. So we lost the braking point there, hit the wall, we've broke our engine, we've broke our suspension, and we've broke the aero. We have to carry that damage all the way to the pits here, and then stay in the pits a little bit longer until that damage gets repaired. Now I will give you that the sort of times here to get the damage fixed are very unrealistic. 6 seconds to get the engine fixed seemed a little bit low, but that is beside the point. There is actually heavy damage within Gran Turismo Sport, it's just not used within the sport mode part of the game, and there is a number of reasons why that is the case. Now there is a few other things to discuss. I think some people maybe point out that Gran Turismo Sport doesn't have a day-night transition or an evolving track, both of which are fair points, but there is different times of day condition in Gran Turismo that you can select, and there is also wet weather. iRacing doesn't have wet weather. iRacing is considered one of the most accurate sims out there, but doesn't have wet weather. Kind of blows that point out the water a little bit. And when it comes to the evolving track, that really only matters, I think, if you're doing anything longer than a 1 hour race. The vast majority of races in ACC and iRacing are set over 20 to 40 minutes. The track's barely going to evolve, the weather doesn't really change, so I don't think those can be really points that are hammered out as a difference to really differentiate a game from being sim and not sim, just because Gran Turismo Sport doesn't have them. Don't get me wrong, I think they're good features, the day-night transition and the evolving track. I would love to have them in Gran Turismo Sport, but I don't think not having them can sort of then make you say that the game is not a racing sim. So that, Your Honour, is my case presented to you as to why Gran Turismo Sport is indeed a sim when compared to iRacing and Assetto Corsa Competizione. I believe it does enough similar to those games, or has enough of the features within the game to sit within the same category. You may agree, you may not agree, that's fine, that's the whole point of these opinion pieces. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, one thing we do need to point out though is that Polyphony Digital do take a different direction with sport mode. So some of the things that I've demonstrated here within the game, or trying to sort of the evidence that I've put forward, do not feature in sport mode, and that would be a fair thing to point out. So for example, the Group 4 cars in GT Sport within sport mode have ABS, whereas if they were to be more realistic and more sim-like, if you like, they would turn ABS off in those cars, and they'd obviously make them a little bit more difficult. And we obviously don't have the heavy damage within sport mode, but these are all choices taken by the developers in order to give the game a certain amount of accessibility. Now, Polyphony Digital can't just turn off 80% of their player base to try and cater for the other 20%, and that's just why I believe these things are not within the sport mode part of the game. So Gran Turismo Sport, at its current state, even 3 years old, still has over 100,000 people who set, or sorry, certainly 100,000 accounts that set a lap time within sport mode. I'm going to imagine at least 90% of those people are not, well certainly 80% are not full on sim racers, hardcore racers, that kind of thing, whatever you want to call them. And so they have to have parts of the game, or they have to give the game that pick up and play factor to cater to the majority, I guess. Now, don't get me wrong, I would love PD to kind of maybe put in a race D or something where they kind of, or even just call it full sim mode, where we could have heavy damage and longer races, tyre wear at times when it, so we're not having to sort of use the multipliers, ABS off on the cars that don't have ABS on. I would love that to be the case, but I understand why they don't do it. So yeah, this is my opinion on why I think Gran Turismo Sport should be considered a sim when compared to ACC and iRacing. Please do hit that like button, please do hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let me know what you think in the comments as well about the video, whether you think I've maybe presented a case, maybe I've changed your mind. That would be interesting to hear. But yeah, until the next video, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you on the next one. Goodbye now.